CSEC, Human and Social Biology, Paper 2, Broad Topics, Speedrun. Let's go. Cellular organization. So first of all, the cell is the basic unit of life. In each cell are organelles such as the nucleus and the mitochondrion. Each of these performs specific roles in the cell. Now the cells can be specialized or differentiated for the structures to perform specific functions. So for example, sperm cells have flagella or like little tails that allow them to swim towards eggs to fertilize them. Now many similar cells comprise tissues, and many similar tissues combine to form organs. In this case here, we could have muscle cells that form cardiac muscle tissue, which is found in the heart. And the heart is part of a bigger organ system that is called the circulatory system. So organs together with many tissues form organ systems in an organism. So the order here is going to be organelle, cell, tissue, organ, organ system, organism in terms of increasing complexity. Here we have an animal cell. Animal cells have a more globular, irregular shape. In the animal cell, the organelles include the nucleus, which contains genetic material that includes DNA and RNA, and it regulates cell activity. Then we have the mitochondrion, and this is the site of ATP production or respiration. The jelly-like substance that fills up the cell and helps keep its shape is the cytoplasm, and this is also the site of chemical reactions. Surrounding the cell is the cell membrane or the plasma membrane, and this facilitates entry and exit of some molecules based on their charge and based on their size. Basically, only small molecules can enter and exit. Thus, it is called partially permeable. Within the animal cell, there are small temporary vacuoles which act as water and mineral storages. There's an endoplasmic reticulum or an ER, and these help to package proteins, and these are usually lined with ribosomes that help synthesize or make proteins. Here we have an undifferentiated plant cell. This has a more regular, elongated shape. It contains many similar organelles as the animal cell, which includes the nucleus, mitochondria, the cytoplasm, the cell membrane, the ribosomes, and the endoplasmic reticulum, and vacuoles, except now the vacuole in the plant cell is large and permanent. This is because the plant cannot actually get up and move around. It has to store much more water and minerals than an animal cell does. There are three organelles that are not found in animal cells and only found in plant cells. In this case here, this would be the chloroplast, which is the site of photosynthesis or glucose production using light. The outermost layer, which is called the cellulose cell wall, this supports and maintains the internal water pressure in the cell, and it prevents the cell from bursting or undergoing lysis. And within there are starch grains, which are energy reserves. Let's compare both types of cells. The nucleus is found in both animals and plants. Mitochondria, both. Cytoplasm, both. Cell membrane, both types of cells. The chloroplast is not found in an animal cell but only in plant cells. Same thing with the cellulose cell wall, not in an animal cell but is in a plant cell. The endoplasmic reticulum and the ribosomes are found in both. The energy storage in an animal cell is due to glycogen granules, but in a plant cell it is starch grains. And vacuoles are found in both, but in animal cells it is small and temporary. In plant cells they are large and permanent. Specialized or differentiated cells have specific tasks in multicellular organisms, and thus they have features and adaptations to assist in performing those tasks. So below we have a few examples. Red blood cells transport oxygen and carbon dioxide. That is the function of the red blood cells. Now to help with that, they have a disc shape or biconcave shape similar to a donut without a hole, and this easily allows oxygen to diffuse into the red blood cell. It also helps to keep the oxygen within. It has hemoglobin to bind the oxygen and no organelles, so that it has a high oxygen carrying capacity. The sperm cell helps to fertilize the egg. It has a tail or a flagellum that allows it to swim. It has chemicals in the head of the sperm that help it to penetrate the egg. The neuron transports electrical messages through the body. On the cell body, it has branches or dendrites that connect to other neurons. There are also chemicals that are secreted called neurotransmitters that help to regulate transmission. Epithelial cells line the surfaces of organs, such as the small intestine and the alveoli. They are very thin to allow diffusion of materials, and they may have hairs or cilia to increase surface area. Muscle cells tend to have a high amount of mitochondria to facilitate a high rate of respiration and energy release. They have to do a lot of work, so they can contract and they can relax. Egg cells are large, much larger than sperm cells, and can contain receptors on their cell membranes that interact with the binding of sperm cells. Connective tissue cells contain structural proteins like collagen and are found in tendons, bones, and fatty tissue. Viruses are not cells. They are actually non-living and non-cellular. They are pathogens that cause infection. All viruses are harmful. They contain a protein coat that houses DNA and RNA, and these provide instructions to the ribosomes in cells to make more copies of viruses to infect more cells. They are spikes on the outer envelope that act as keys that allow them to enter the cells. Bacteria are much larger than viruses, and some bacteria can be beneficial to humans, such as the ones in yogurt. They do not have a nucleus, instead they have loose DNA in a nucleoid region, and they have circular DNA called plasmids. They have cell walls for support similar to plants, but it's not made of cellulose, and some of them have flagella or tails that allow them to be motile or be able to move. Fungus cells are similar to plant cells except they don't have chloroplasts. They have cell walls made up of chitin, not cellulose, and they reproduce by budding, which is breaking off a section of a cell which would then develop into a new cell. Examples of fungi would be bread mold and yeast. Photosynthesis is a process where producers take in inorganic molecules and using energy from sunlight produce organic substances such as glucose. Photosynthesis occurs in chloroplasts, which contain the green pigment chlorophyll. The main inorganic molecules or reactants are carbon dioxide, which enter through the leaves, and water, which enter through the roots. Remember, glucose is the main product and oxygen is released as a byproduct. Here's a formula for photosynthesis. You only have to concern yourself with the word formula. Carbon dioxide plus water gives you glucose plus oxygen. Here we have a setup to observe the effect of light on photosynthesis. So when undergoing photosynthesis, a plant would release oxygen. So if you use an underwater plant such as Elodia, this would release oxygen bubbles in the water. And as I said, you would see it as rising bubbles gathering at the top of an inverted test tube. So you see a little column of air here, and this will begin bigger and bigger as the plant photosynthesizes. So as you increase the intensity of this light bulb here, the rate of oxygen bubbles will also increase. So you'll be seeing more and more bubbles coming out at a faster rate. This is because photosynthesis is occurring at a faster rate if you was to make this light bulb brighter. However, past a certain light intensity, you could say that the chlorophyll becomes saturated with light particles and the rate of evolution of oxygen will be the same throughout. That means that if you make the bulb brighter past a certain point, you're not going to get a further increase in bubbles. So oxygen is released from the leaves during photosynthesis, as just said. And you can actually observe this by using a glowing splint. It's similar to a long match. And what this would do is that it would react with the oxygen and it would allow a smaller flame to combust and burn more brightly. So if you was to light this and put it in oxygen or put it close to a leaf that is releasing oxygen, you will see that it would combust into a bigger flame. This proves that oxygen is released during photosynthesis. Testing for presence of starch in leaves. Well, excess glucose is converted to starch, which is stored in leaves, roots, shoots, stems, and fruits. Presence of starch indicates that photosynthesis has occurred or is occurring. So how do you test for starch? Well, first of all, you have to place the leaf in a water bath to break down the cell walls. This is basically heated water. Then you place the leaf in ethanol to remove the chlorophyll. Remember, the leaf without the chlorophyll would not look as green. It would look like a very pale green, or it would look kind of whitish. Next, using a dropper, you add a few drops of iodine solution. And wherever there's a blue-black color, that is going to indicate the presence of starch. You can easily test this using a variegated leaf, which is a leaf that contains chlorophyll in some parts and no chlorophyll in other parts. Of course, the green areas have chlorophyll, and these are the areas that are going to contain starch. These are the areas that are going to photosynthesize. So when the starch test is carried out, the previously green areas are going to turn blue-black because those there contain starch. The iodine is going to react with the parts that contain chlorophyll, and the parts that didn't contain chlorophyll, the iodine is not going to react with that, so those are not going to experience a color change. Here we have the carbon cycle, and first, to understand the carbon cycle, let's start with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There's really only two ways in which carbon dioxide is removed from the atmosphere. The main way is through photosynthesis, where carbon dioxide is absorbed into the leaves of plants and then transfixed into carbohydrates such as glucose and starch. The other way, which is not shown in this diagram, is when carbon dioxide is absorbed by the ocean or water sources. So let's start with photosynthesis. So plants undergo this process and they remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, so it keeps it from building up. Next, animals are going to feed on the plants. So consumption is going to happen when the animals eat the plants. They're going to get those carbohydrates and that carbon in their bodies. Animals now will respire, and when they respire, basically when they breathe out, the animals are going to exhale CO2, and that's going to return to the atmosphere. When the animals and the plants die, they are going to decompose, and the decomposers are going to break down the organic dead matter, and that is also going to release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But whatever remains in the soil over a long period of time, that is going to fossilize. So fossilization occurs when the decomposed material become fossil fuels after many years. Basically, when they get compressed and over a long period of time with some heat, these turn into oils or fossil fuels. Now, those fossil fuels are pumped up and are then burnt to power things like automobiles and factories, and even the electricity that we have here. All of that there is run by oil and gas. So when fossil fuels are burnt, that releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The main problem is when we burn too many fossil fuels, and this atmospheric carbon dioxide level starts to increase drastically. And especially if we start to cut down trees, there will be less and less ability to remove that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So deforestation means that fewer trees lead to a decrease in the rate of photosynthesis. There's less leaves to take up that carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is not diffused into the leaves, and the levels remain very high. Now, if we burn a lot of fossil fuels all the time, this will raise carbon levels due to the emission of gaseous carbon compounds into the atmosphere. Lastly, if we have a lot of sewage runoff, that excess carbon dioxide from the sewage would cause oceans to become acidified. So the overall impact on humans from the carbon cycle is, well, climate change. More heat energy from the sun is trapped in the atmosphere. This would increase temperatures and more adverse weather patterns, for example, hurricanes. Sea level rise occurs when the polar ice caps melt due to this rise in temperature, and coral bleaching, as just said, when excess carbon dioxide causes oceans to become acidified. This would destroy any coral reefs and any aquatic life that lives within the coral reef. So how do we reduce our human impact on carbon cycle? Well, first there's reforestation. This basically means replanting trees that have been cut down. This will reverse any habitat loss for animals and allow photosynthesis to occur at greater rates to remove their carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We can use alternate forms of energy, so for example, wind turbines, solar panels, hydroelectric dams, and biofuels from crop harvests. All of these here reduce the combustion of fossil fuels and thus the release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We can just reduce our fossil fuel usage, so basically encouraging carpooling, public transport, using more energy efficient fluorescent lights, hybrid vehicles, more energy efficient appliances. And then we have carbon taxes, which the normal citizen cannot employ, but governments can, and these provide incentives to companies and countries to limit carbon dioxide emissions. Basically, they will produce a fine for some companies if they go over a certain limit. You could also produce fines for open combustion of materials. So when like residents burn rubbish, that also releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The nervous system consists of the central nervous system, or CNS, and this includes the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS, and this includes the spinal and cranial nerves. So electrical impulses or action potentials are very rapid messengers of sensory input from receptor cells and carrying instructions to effectors, such as muscles or glands. So neurons are cells which make up these pathways, and nerves are bundles of these neurons. So basically throughout these cells here, we are going to get electrical signals being sent from sensory organs such as the skin, for example, to the brain, to the spinal cord, and eventually to muscles so that we can react to those signals. So there are three types of neurons: sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons or relay neurons. Let's look at motor neurons. So motor neurons, on the end here we have a cell body, and this contains organelles such as nuclei and mitochondria. Branching out from these cell bodies are dendrons and smaller dendrites. These conduct impulses received from other neurons. You could think of them as connecting points. The axon is a long process that goes along the cell, and this is where the impulses are conducted. So the impulses will be conducted through the dendrites, through the cell body, and down the axon like this. Think of the axon as a cord that is attached to the cell body. Neurons are involved in the life process called irritability, which is the ability to detect and react to stimuli. So here we have sensory neurons. So sensory neurons are found on the sense organs such as the skin or the retina, and they detect stimuli and pass them on to the central nervous system to be interpreted. A stimulus is any detectable change that occurs in the environment. So for example, a change in temperature. Remember, motor neurons are connected to effectors, and these effectors are like muscles or glands, and these could facilitate movement or responses to these stimuli. So for example, let's say that you touch a hot flame, the burn on your hand, the increase in temperature is the stimulus, but you moving your hand away is the response. Sensory neurons are similar in structure to motor neurons, as you could see here, but the cell body is not on the end. Instead, the cell body is located in the middle of the axon. Now between two neurons there's a gap. That gap is called a synapse, and synapses are sites that lie between two successive neurons. So there's a gap between the two neurons called the synaptic cleft, and there are chemicals secreted from the neuron through these little sacs called vesicles, and these chemicals are called neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters, an example is acetylcholine. These allow the propagation of electrical impulses across the synapses. Basically what that means is that think of the neurotransmitter building a bridge between the two neurons so it could cross this little gap here. So when the impulse comes through this neuron, the neurotransmitter could allow it to go to this other neuron here. So nicotine from cigarettes also acts as a neurotransmitter, but it causes the synapse to fire too often. Synapses help to regulate transmission of electrical impulses so that the nerves don't fire too often. So when there's a problem with the production of neurotransmitter, this is where that area might go numb. If there's an overproduction of it, that's where the person might have like Parkinson's, where they'll be moving involuntarily. Here we have the human brain. The human brain consists of the main region, which is called the cerebrum, the hindbrain, which is called the cerebellum, the brainstem or the medulla oblongata. We have the hypothalamus, which is like a regulatory center, and we have the pituitary gland, which is the master gland for the release of hormones. So the cerebrum deals with memory, emotion, judgment, and senses, for example, sight and hearing. Without this, we wouldn't be able to do any of those things. The cerebellum is used for movement and coordination. The medulla oblongata, or the brainstem, is used for the autonomic nervous system. These are the things that you don't really think about. So this includes breathing, heart rate, reflexes, involuntary movements. The hypothalamus is used for the regulation of body temperature, and the pituitary gland regulates the release of certain hormones. So as said before, stimulus is a detectable change in the environment that the body can react to. In this case here, the food is the stimulus, or the scent of the food, and the response from the dog is going to be to produce saliva. So other examples would be an increase in temperature, increase in light intensity, a painful hit on the body, and the response is the body's reaction or change as a result of detecting the stimulus. So for example, an increase in temperature would cause sweating, a decrease in temperature would cause shivering, an increase in light intensity would help the pupil constrict, a painful hit, you would probably move away from the danger. So an involuntary response is called a reflex. Now, reflexes can be conditioned if there is repeated exposure to the stimuli and repeated responses over time. So, for example, if you're training a dog with a whistle or with food, or you have a little clicker which you're training a cat to approach you. Voluntary actions are deliberate actions that involve thought or input from the brain. So basically, the signal travels from the brain through the spinal cord and then to motor neurons that connect to muscles. So if you have to lift this glass of water to drink it, you'd have to think about it, send that signal to your muscles, and that would lift your hand for you to drink the water. That's a deliberate action. So motor neurons connect to effectors such as muscles, which will act on the electrical signal to enact responses. Involuntary actions or reflex acts. So these are rapid actions that are automatic and they do not involve input or analysis from the brain. So there's no sensory input from the brain in this case. So if you have a spinal reflex, so for example, let's say someone touches this flame by mistake and they have to pull away their hand. The electrical signal or the electrical impulse is going to travel from the receptors in the finger to the sensory neurons in the hand, and then to relay neurons or interneurons in the spinal cord, then to motor neurons that will connect to effectors in the muscle. Remember, the effectors are what help with the response. In this case here, it's going to help to withdraw the hand from the flame or the hot stove, or if it's with the knee, it's going to provide a knee-jerk reflex. So there are cranial reflexes as well that do not really involve the spinal cord, and in this case here the message is sent to the motor neurons and cranial muscles. So this is basically when you have a reflex that involves the face. So for example, blinking if there's something approaching you, or the pupil reflex, whereas spinal reflexes more deal with moving your body. Here we have an internal view of the eye. Feel free to pause the video and note the labels, because there's a lot to unpack here. First, let's look at the cornea. The cornea is the front part of the eye. It is a very thin layer, and this helps to refract the light so that it can actually enter the eye. The light enters the eye through a small hole called the pupil, and the iris adjusts the size of the pupil based on the light intensity. We'll get more into that later. So the light enters through the pupil and the lens focuses that light on the retina. The retina contains receptor cells called rods and cones. These help to form an image. The fovea is the highest concentration of those receptor cells. So when the image is formed on the retina, this is at the back of the eye, the image is actually inverted. And now it must be sent to the brain to be analyzed and processed. So how that image is sent to the brain is that it is converted into electrical signals and sent via the optic nerve. The optic nerve is going to connect to the cerebrum, and the brain is going to reinvert or reorient the image so that we see it right side up. If any light rays fall on this point here on the optic nerve, no image is going to be formed here. This is called your blind spot. So other parts of the eye that help with focusing involve the suspensory ligaments and the ciliary muscles. These are connected to the lens. So let's say for example, if you have to look at something very close, the ciliary muscles are going to contract and the suspensory ligaments are going to loosen a little bit. And what's going to happen is that this lens is going to change size. We'll get more into that just now. This lens is going to change size and it's going to be thicker, and that's going to help to focus on closer objects. And further objects, the opposite is going to happen. So the part that protects the eye is called the sclera. This is the white part of the eye, and this is what will prevent it from mechanical damage and so on. The active fluid within the eye that helps to regulate its pressure is called vitreous humor. On the front of the eye, it is called aqueous humor. And the choroid prevents any internal reflection of light within the eye. So let's go through this again. The cornea refracts the light as it enters the pupil. The iris is going to adjust the size of the pupil in bright and dark environments. The lens is going to change shape to focus the light on the sensory cells at the back of the eye. This is where the retina and the fovea are. The image forms on the retina, and that's going to be inverted and is going to be sent to the brain via the optic nerve as electrical impulses. At the brain, the image is then going to be processed and analyzed and reoriented. Accommodation is the process where the lens becomes thicker or thinner to focus light on the lens. So when you're looking at a near object, if you look here, the object as it's getting closer, the lens is going to thicken. This is because the ciliary muscles are going to contract and the suspensory ligaments are going to loosen. And if you look at a distant object, so you see here when this object is further away, the lens is flatter. This is because the ciliary muscles relax and the suspensory ligaments tighten. So once again, you can see here, if the person is looking at a distant object, their lens would flatten. This is because the ciliary muscles relax and so as you can see here, once again, if you're looking at a distant object, the lens would flatten. The ciliary muscles would relax and the suspensory ligaments are going to tighten. If you are looking at a close object, imagine that you're looking, if you put your finger close to your eye and you try to focus on it, you notice that there's a strain in your eye. This is because the lens is thickening due to the contraction of the ciliary muscles. The suspensory ligaments are going to loosen to allow this to happen. Now, in both these cases here, you'll notice that the light rays converge exactly on the retina. This is to form a sharp image. If the light rays do not converge on the retina, you're going to get a blurry image. So this is what happens when a person is short-sighted or long-sighted. So in this case here, you'll see that the image is not formed on the retina, but they are formed either before the retina or after. In this case here, we're going to get blurry images. So short-sightedness or short-sighted vision or nearsightedness is caused by the lens being too thick or the eyeball being too long. The image is going to form before the retina. It means that the light is going to be focused a little too much. So in this case here, the image is formed within the vitreous humor, not on the retina, the sharpest image. This is also called myopia, and it needs concave lenses to mend it. Long-sighted vision or far-sighted vision or hypermetropia occurs when the lens is too weak or is too thin, the eyeball is too short, and in this case here the image forms behind the retina and not on the retina itself. You need convex lenses in order to mend this. Other eye conditions include astigmatism, which occur due to the deformation of the cornea. So without special lenses or laser corrective surgery, the images are blurred. Glaucoma occurs due to the buildup of capillary pressure or intraocular pressure near the optic nerve. This is within the vitreous humor of the eye. This would cause blurry vision and pain, and prescription eye drops and oral medication may help to alleviate this. Cataracts are clouding of the lens in the eye. Basically, you could see it as little white spots within the eye that basically block the pupil and the lens. These can be surgically removed. Diabetes can lead to damage of the optic nerve, and this leads to blurry vision and eventual blindness. Hormones are secretions of endocrine glands that are directly released into the bloodstream and act as chemical messengers. They act on target cells that have receptors specific to that hormone. They are typically slow acting but have prolonged or long-term metabolic effects. So these are usually released, let's say, for the regulation of blood sugar or during puberty or the regulation of water in the blood. So these endocrine glands secrete their substances directly into the bloodstream. They do not have any ducts, or they are also called ductless glands. These include the pituitary gland in the brain, the thyroid gland in the neck, the adrenal glands that are right above the kidneys, the pancreas. In women, there's the ovaries, and in men, there's the testes. So some examples of hormones include ADH or antidiuretic hormone. These help to conserve water in the kidneys and in the bloodstream so that it can be reused for sweat and you don't urinate out all the water. Adrenaline is used to increase heart rate and breathing rate in scenarios of stress, like when you're writing the HSB exam. Growth hormone stimulates growth in body tissues. Glucagon promotes the breakdown of glycogen to glucose. Insulin promotes the conversion of glucose to glycogen. Both of these are secreted by the pancreas. Estrogen and progesterone, we'll get into that just now. These help with the maturation of egg cells and the building up of the uterus lining or endometrium. Thyroxine, which is secreted by the thyroid, helps to regulate metabolism and growth within the body. So some differences between nervous and endocrine systems and action would include, well, first, the transport medium. The nervous system uses neurons, nerves, and neurotransmitter chemicals. The endocrine system secretes their hormones into the bloodstream. The signal carrier for the nervous system is the electrical impulses, but the endocrine system is with hormones secreted from these ductless or endocrine glands. The transmission speed of the nervous system is very fast because it uses electricity. The endocrine system is slower because it relies on the bloodstream to get the hormones around. The nervous system has a more short-term response effect, so typically what happens as a response is short-term, is not long-lasting. And the endocrine system is either prolonged or long-term. Let's say, for example, in puberty, the effects of the hormones last for several months or years. Reproduction. So reproduction is the production of new individuals or offspring from parent individuals. We have two types, asexual and sexual. Asexual reproduction involves one parent. It typically occurs in bacteria, protozoa, and some plants and animals. The example would be starfish, sea anemones, and yeast. The offspring DNA is identical to the parent as cell division or mitosis occurs. That occurs when there's only one cell division and one parent cell splits into two daughter cells. Sexual reproduction, on the other hand, involves two parents, a mother and a father, and these produce gametes or sex cells. In the case here, the father produces sperm cells, the mother produces egg cells, and these occur due to a process called meiosis, and meiosis basically halves the amount of chromosomes in these gametes. When these fuse or when fertilization occurs, it forms a zygote, and then that eventually becomes a fetus and a baby. Here we have the male reproductive system. Feel free to pause the video to look at the labels, but let's go through it here. The testes secrete the hormone testosterone, and this helps to facilitate sperm production. This is held within the scrotum. Now, the scrotum is a sac that holds the testes, and this can change position dependent on temperature because sperm production occurs at a certain temperature. And of course, this is to maximize sperm production. So for example, in colder temperatures, the scrotum would move closer to the inside of the body for warmth. So next we have the prostate gland and the seminal vesicles, and these help to produce semen for the transport of sperm cells into the vagina and uterus. Sperm is different from semen because sperm is actually the cells that will swim in the liquid semen. So upon ejaculation, sperm cells are released from the vas deferens. This is called the sperm duct. These connect the testes to the prostate, and eventually the sperm cells will swim out of the urethra. So about 200 million sperm cells are released, and an egg can only be fertilized by one sperm cell. Here we have the female reproductive system, which is thankfully not as physically complex as the male reproductive system. So here, egg cells are released from the ovary once per menstrual cycle. These egg cells are transported along the fallopian tubes or the oviducts, and they are swept by tiny hairs called cilia along the fallopian tubes. So it is here, this position here, where the sperm may meet with the egg and fertilization may occur for them to fuse into a zygote. So if fertilized, the egg is going to implant on the uterus wall or the endometrium to become an embryo or fetus. This is where it's going to develop a placenta, an amniotic sac, and an umbilical cord. The cervix separates the vagina from the uterus, and the cervix would dilate during childbirth to allow the passage of the fetus. It would also dilate during menstruation. So the egg is released from the ovary during ovulation, and during this time, hormones called estrogen and progesterone, which are secreted from the ovaries, allow the rapid division of cells in the uterus lining. This would cause the uterus lining to thicken. So during fertilization, the sperm cell DNA is going to fuse with the egg cell DNA. That's going to form a zygote. That would eventually become a fetus. But in order for that to happen, the zygote has to implant on the endometrium or the uterus wall. Think of it as planting a seed in soil. So implantation of the zygote occurs to allow the formation of three embryonic structures as mentioned before: the placenta, the umbilical cord, and the amnion. So during pregnancy or gestation, these three embryonic structures are going to help with the growth and development of the fetus. So the placenta contains many blood vessels that transport nutrients such as glucose and amino acids, oxygen, and antibodies from the mother to the fetus. It would also remove any waste material like carbon dioxide and urea from the fetus. The umbilical cord is going to allow the transfer of materials from the placenta to the fetus. So the umbilical cord is connected to the navel here, and this is the bridge between the placenta and the fetus. The amnion contains amniotic fluid, and this acts as a shock absorber. Basically, it helps to prevent the fetus from being injured by external collisions or trauma. Let's say that the mother was to get hit into her belly, this amniotic fluid is going to absorb the force. It also supports the fetus against gravity, helps with the development of limbs, and it also helps to regulate its body temperature because most of it is water. So during childbirth, what's going to happen here is that amniotic sac is going to rupture, and abdominal and uterine contractions are going to begin occurring in the uterus wall. What actually initiates those contractions here is a hormone called oxytocin, and more of that hormone is produced during labor. So then the baby is pushed out through the cervix. Remember, the cervix is going to dilate, it's going to become wider, and crowning is going to occur as the head emerges through the vagina. Contractions are going to continue to push the baby head first. There are going to be more and more contractions even after childbirth because the placenta also has to be expelled from the vagina. This is called the afterbirth. Prenatal and postnatal care. Prenatal refers to events before birth, postnatal for after birth. Prenatal care includes adequate diet. This is for the mother. This includes the addition of proteins for growth and development, iron for red blood cell and hemoglobin production, calcium and vitamin D for bone formation. Frequent medical visits. So this includes ultrasound monitoring for the heart rate and monitoring of other organs as well to ensure that there are no tumors or no deformities. The avoidance of drugs. This includes nicotine, alcohol, and any non-prescribed drugs should be generally avoided because whatever is in the mother's bloodstream is likely to enter the fetus's bloodstream. Postnatal care would include breastfeeding. This is to provide nutrition and antibodies to the baby. Will be a baby in this case, not a fetus. And this is called passive immunity. And next we have immunization. This would include vaccines, and this is to deter communicable infections, for example, measles, mumps, and rubella. So what are the effects of smoking and alcohol while pregnant? Well, of course, these should be avoided because the baby can be, in terms of smoking, the baby can be born with a nicotine addiction and can experience withdrawal symptoms, even though the baby wouldn't even know what a cigarette is. Nicotine also constricts blood vessels in the placenta. This means that any nutrient and oxygen transfer to the fetus would be limited. And, of course, this could lead to the baby being born prematurely and underweight. The tar in the lungs would limit oxygen intake by the mother, and of course the baby's or the fetus's cells would not respire properly. Alcohol should be avoided while pregnant because they have this syndrome called fetal alcohol syndrome, which results in mental and physical underdevelopment, and there's also alcohol poisoning of the fetus because, as I said, whatever goes into the mother's bloodstream, some of it is going to go into the baby's bloodstream. There are many hormones involved in the menstrual cycle. The four main ones are FSH, LH, estrogen, and progesterone. Let's start with FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone. The egg cell is usually surrounded by a casing called a follicle or Graafian follicle. FSH stimulates the growth of that follicle, and this here would help to hold the egg cell before ovulation. LH, or luteinizing hormone. When there's a surge of luteinizing hormone, this is going to trigger the rupturing of that follicle and allow the egg cell to be released. This is when ovulation is going to occur. Now, all this time here, we would have had estrogen being released. This would have helped to thicken the uterus wall or the endometrium for implantation in case the egg gets fertilized. Estrogen also helps to stimulate the increase of luteinizing hormone. Progesterone is released from the follicle after it releases the egg, and this helps to maintain the thickness of the uterus lining. Let's say that that the egg gets fertilized but the uterus is not thick enough. That means that the egg, even though it is fertilized, would not be able to be implanted and cannot develop things like an umbilical cord and a placenta, which means that it would not develop into a fetus. There are three main phases of the menstrual cycle: the follicular phase, the luteal phase, and at the end of the luteal phase, there's menstruation. Let's start with the follicular phase as you see here. In the follicular phase, the Graafian follicle that contains the egg, we can see that the little circle inside here, that's the egg, would develop and mature due to the secretion of FSH. So FSH is going to stimulate an increase in estrogen. So estrogen is the yellow line, and also is going to trigger a surge in LH. That is the red line that you're seeing here. So you're seeing here the surge is this big peak here. So the surge in LH is going to trigger ovulation. Ovulation is when the follicle ruptures and releases the egg, as you see in here. This occurs around day 14 of the menstrual cycle, basically in the middle of the cycle. So in this case here, the egg is released from the ovary, and that marks the end of the follicular phase. The luteal phase occurs after the surge in luteinizing hormone, LH. So at this point here, the LH levels begin to drop, they begin to decrease. The follicle, after it has released the egg, turns into something called a corpus luteum. That is what you're seeing here. This corpus luteum is going to secrete progesterone. And this progesterone now is going to help to maintain the thickness of this endometrium or uterus lining. This is in case the egg gets fertilized, it can implant on the stick-on uterus lining. So these progesterone levels will stay high for a few days, and implantation is possible at this time. Now during menses or menstruation, same thing. This is at the end of the luteal phase. What happens here is that the corpus luteum, which would have been the follicle, would have broken down. And because this has broken down, it's not going to release progesterone anymore. You'll notice that when this is present, progesterone levels go up. When this has broken down, progesterone levels go down. Well, this is also correlated to the thickness of the uterus lining or the endometrium. So when these progesterone levels rapidly decrease, that leads to a breakdown in the uterus lining. So what happens now is that the uterus wall begins to shed, and the unfertilized egg and the endometrium material are shed through the vagina. FSH and estrogen levels actually slightly increase during this phase. Contraception, so also called birth control, and this refers to any method that prevents pregnancy from occurring. So why you'd want to do that? It was basically used by families that wish to avoid the financial and emotional strains of raising a child. Raising a child not easy. But it's also used to limit population growth in countries and combat overpopulation. So this can occur via two ways. Well, contraception is the prevention of fertilization of the egg. And examples of these types of methods would be condoms, Reproductive method, vasectomies, and tubal ligations. There's also anti-implantation methods where fertilization of the egg occurs, but the fertilized egg cannot be implanted on the endometrium. So examples of this would be IUDs or intrauterine devices or morning after pills. Let's go into how these work. So first, let's start with barrier methods of contraception. So condoms prevent sperm from entering the vagina because basically they cover the penis and the urethra. Diaphragms prevent sperm from entering the uterus. And these also protect against sexually transmitted infections if used correctly. Next we have the natural method or the Reproductive method. Basically this involves the girl or the woman pinpointing the day or the series of days where she thinks she's going to ovulate, time of ovulation, and is simply going to avoid intercourse at that time. This is very unreliable because the period of ovulation, that window actually changes dependent on situations of stress, changes in diet, and changes in environment. There are surgical methods, so there are two in particular, vasectomies and tubal ligations. So for a vasectomy, this involves the ligation, which is the cutting and tying of the vas deferens or the sperm duct. And this would prevent sperm from reaching the urethra. So sperm cells are still produced, but they are simply not released during ejaculation. The male in this case is sterile. Tubal ligation is the tying and cutting of the fallopian tubes. This would prevent the eggs from being released into the uterus. Eggs are still produced, but they cannot be fertilized because the sperm cells cannot reach the egg cells. These both have very high success rates, but they offer no protection against sexually transmitted infections. Hormonal methods of birth control or birth control pills have different modes of action, and this could include to suppress ovulation, so no egg is released at all, to thicken the cervical mucus so that sperm cells, it acts as a barrier for sperm cells so they cannot enter the uterus. And it can also help to reduce endometrium thickness so that no implantation occurs. Basically, there's no soil to plant the seed. There are numerous side effects with using birth control pills, so typically only girls that reach a certain age or have a doctor's prescription should take them. These side effects would include things like mood swings, fatigue, and bloating or weight gain. Male contraceptive pills are not, they only works, but they're not out in market yet. But how these could work, potentially, basically, they could reduce testosterone levels in the men and decrease sperm production. They can make the sperm immobile, make them unable to swim, or they can thicken mucus in the vas deferens, so when the man does ejaculate, very little sperm cells are released. Now, what you have to remember about birth control pills for women is that they have to be taken at the beginning of the cycle and they have to be taken every day for them to be effective. Next, we have morning after pills or emergency contraception. This would occur after fertilization has taken place or after sexual intercourse has taken place. There are various types that exist. So the mechanism of action involves delaying ovulation or causing changes in the endometrium that limit implantation if it has already been fertilized, the egg. But what do I mean by delaying ovulation? Well, sperm cells can live up to 2 to 3 days within the uterus. So let's say that the woman has sex by Monday and she is ovulating Tuesday or Wednesday, she can still get pregnant. But let's say by Thursday, those sperm cells would die, then you could delay ovulation to Friday, so that by the time she releases the egg, all the sperm cells would have died by then. So this must be taken up to 3 days after fertilization occurs or 3 days after the woman has had sex, despite the name being morning after. Other birth control pills must be taken every day from the start of the cycle to be effective. So here we have the mechanical method now, which is the use of IUDs or intrauterine devices. These are small T-shaped pieces of plastic or copper which stimulate the production of white blood cells to destroy the sperm cells. Sometimes the IUDs would produce toxins that would be poisonous to the sperm cells. They could also produce hormones that would thin the endometrium to prevent implantation from occurring. Abortion refers to the premature termination of a pregnancy. Basically, this is not a contraceptive method because this does not prevent pregnancy, this prevents childbirth. So we have two different types. Spontaneous abortions, also called miscarriages, occur due to some internal issues such as a direct trauma, illness, or chromosomal defect. In some cases, if the mother is malnourished, there will be a miscarriage. These do not involve the action of a doctor or clinic. Clinical abortions occur when the pregnancy is deemed undesirable by the mother or is a threat to her life. So the fetus is extracted from the uterus by a doctor. In countries that are pro-life, they believe that life starts at conception, basically when the egg gets fertilized. In those countries, this is deemed unethical. But it is sometimes justified in cases of rape, incest, or when the fetus poses a fatal danger to the mother's life. Health and disease. Well, according to the World Health Organization or the WHO, health is defined as the complete state of physical, mental, and social well-being. Disease is defined as the impairment of the functioning of the body and mind. So diseases can be communicable or non-communicable. Communicable means that they can be spread from one individual to another, they are infectious, and they are caused by pathogens. Non-communicable means that they cannot be spread from one individual to another. They may be caused by a lifestyle or may be inherited. So there are many categories of disease. However, it is important to keep in mind that any one disease cannot be placed in a single category. So for example, diabetes could be considered chronic because it is a long-term disease, but it also could be considered physiological because it is caused by a malfunction in an organ or system, in this case here the pancreas. So physiological diseases also include coronary heart disease and asthma. Mental diseases are those that occur due to the impairment of the mind or the tissues within the brain. These include Alzheimer's disease, clinical depression, and neurosis. Other examples of chronic diseases would be chronic bronchitis and asthma. Infectious diseases are all communicable, and this could be caused by the introduction of pathogens to the body. This would be viruses, bacteria, protozoans, or fungi. Examples would be dengue fever, which is caused by a virus, malaria, which is caused by a protozoan, and cholera, which is caused by bacteria. Social diseases are caused by an individual living or working within an environment prone to contamination by pathogens, or having no access to a balanced diet. Let's say that the only water that they have is from a river that is often polluted. So examples of this would be cholera, dysentery, scurvy, rickets, and night blindness. Degenerative diseases are caused by the gradual loss of function of tissues and organs. Examples would be Alzheimer's disease and osteoarthritis due to the wearing away of cartilage. Deficiency or nutrient deficiency diseases occur due to the lack of a particular nutrient in the diet. Examples would be kwashiorkor or lack of protein, scurvy or lack of vitamin C, night blindness or lack of vitamin A, or rickets or lack of vitamin D or calcium. Hereditary diseases are caused by inheriting alleles that are going to translate to malfunctioning proteins. Basically, your DNA is going to tell your body to operate differently and to form different structures that do not work or function as well. Example would be sickle cell anemia, which forms deformed or sickle-shaped red blood cells, hemophilia, which affects blood clotting, and cystic fibrosis, which affects the lungs and allow the buildup of mucus. Lifestyle diseases or self-inflicted diseases are those that occur due to the intake of excess nutrition or drugs, or that occur due to a sedentary lifestyle. These include liver cirrhosis due to the overconsumption of alcohol, lung cancer due to the exposure to smoke, and coronary heart disease due to improper diet with lots of fats and cholesterols. Signs and symptoms. So signs are observable or testable changes that occur in the body when afflicted with a disease. These are things that you can see. So vomiting, diarrhea, fever, rashes, runny nose. Symptoms, on the other hand, are non-observable changes that occur in the body when afflicted with a disease. These are things that you cannot see, and the patient must explain these to their physician. Examples would be fatigue, dizziness, nausea, headache, joint pain. So these are some common terms that we're going to come across here. Antigens are foreign substances, so for example, viral proteins that enter the body and trigger an immune response. I like to think of antigens as the burglar alarm within the body. Antibodies are proteins produced by lymphocytes, which is a type of white blood cell, and these would help to combat antigens and pathogens. Antitoxins are specific antibodies that eradicate toxins that enter the body. Antibiotics are oral medication or ingested medication that are used to treat bacterial infections, not viral infections. Antiseptics are medications that is applied to bodily surfaces to treat or prevent infection. Let's say that to get a cut on your skin, you would put an antiseptic on that. Disinfectants are chemical agents such as bleach or hand sanitizer that is applied to material surfaces to kill microorganisms. Asthma occurs when bronchioles become constricted and quickly become clogged with mucus. They are usually triggered by inhaling dust, pollen, or smoke, or by excessive physical activity. A muscular relaxant must be used in an inhaler to dilate the airways to allow airflow. Signs and symptoms would include wheezing, shortness of breath, and bronchospasms. Bronchitis occurs due to the irritation of the airways and the lungs by air pollution, example when inhaling smoke, or when there's a bacterial or viral infections. Same way with asthma, excess mucus is produced, and this would foster the growth of bacteria, which will give rise to opportunistic infections such as influenza and pneumonia. Antibiotics can be used if there's a bacterial infection involved. Signs and symptoms would include coughing, shortness of breath, and excess mucus. Cholera and gastroenteritis are caused by the ingestion of harmful bacteria that come from human feces. Example would be Vibrio cholerae and E. coli. This can be due to drinking sewage contaminated water or when flies deposit fecal particles or bacteria on the food. So extreme bouts of stomach pain, vomiting, and diarrhea may ensue, and this could lead to dehydration and even death. So to prevent these two diseases, food should be thoroughly washed and cooked. Water should be boiled or chlorinated, which will kill the bacteria after filtering, which will remove any sediment. Food should be covered and kept far from flies, and hands, utensils, and dishes should be washed before and after meals. Should avoid drinking water from contaminated wells or rivers. So these diseases can be treated with antibiotics, intravenous drips, and restoration of fluids and electrolytes. Cancers refer to a group of diseases where cells in a certain organ or tissue uncontrollably divide. So age influences cancer risk, as it is usually formed due to a random mutation. But there are also chemicals or agents called carcinogens, and these are capable of inducing cancer. Example would be cigarette smoke particulates, ionizing radiation, so for example X-rays or ultraviolet rays from the sun, food additives, and viral RNA, so for example from HPV or the human papillomavirus, which causes cervical cancer in women. So cancers typically occur in the lungs, the prostate, the pancreas, the ovaries, the breast, the uterus, the cervix, and the colon. STIs or sexually transmitted infections are communicable diseases that occur when a pathogen is transferred via sexual contact. Examples of this would include AIDS, which is caused by HIV, syphilis, which is caused by bacteria, Treponema pallidum, gonorrhea, which is caused by bacteria, Neisseria gonorrhoeae, cervical cancer, which is caused by the human papillomavirus or HPV, and chlamydia, which is caused by bacteria. Just some key symptoms here of STIs. Chlamydia, you experience burning during urination, and vaginal and penile discharge. Syphilis, there's body rashes on the back, soles of the feet and palms. Fatigue, hair loss, weight loss, and nervous system damage could occur in newborns or miscarriages. In gonorrhea, there's a mild fever, but is usually characterized by burning during urination and the leakage of pus from the urethra. HIV and AIDS results in rapid weight loss, hair loss, dark lesions on the skin called Kaposi sarcoma, and chronic diarrhea. So once again, to remind you, cancer is a disease that causes the uncontrollable division of cells in a tissue or organ. In this case here, cervical cancer is in the cervix. So cervical cancer is caused by the human papillomavirus or HPV, and this is transmitted during sexual intercourse. Now, because men don't have a cervix, they are not afflicted by HPV. And of course, they cannot get cervical cancer, but they can pass it on to women. So men who have poor hygiene and are uncircumcised have a higher risk of carrying and transmitting HPV because it usually resides within the foreskin. Of course, circumcision is the cutting of the foreskin. So cancers are treated by firing radioactive rays at the affected area. This is called radiotherapy. And this usually results in nausea, hair loss, and weakness. HPV can be detected by doing a pap smear, where a swab sample is taken from a cervix. It can easily be prevented by having male partners wear condoms or simply obtaining the HPV vaccine. So good hygiene prevents communicable diseases such as influenza and cholera, and COVID-19 more recently, by hand washing and dishwashing. So it clears harmful bacteria or bacterial material and viruses away from deposits on the skin and airways. Now, it also helps to eliminate body odors and ensures social acceptance. Basically, you'll be smelling good. It prevents fungal diseases such as ringworm and athlete's foot. And washing genitalia helps to reduce the spread of HPV from men to women. Brushing your teeth regularly with fluoride toothpaste and flossing would help prevent tooth decay. HIV stands for Human Immunodeficiency Virus. AIDS stands for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. The virus is transferred via semen, vaginal fluids, blood transfusions, and breast milk. HIV infects a type of white blood cell called lymphocytes, and these infected cells help HIV multiply and proliferate and infect other lymphocytes. Now, when the T lymphocyte count drops below 200 per millimeter cube of blood, the patient is said to have AIDS. In this case here, the person is severely immunocompromised. There's a severe immune deficiency as acquired over time. So HIV is very difficult to detect and produce a vaccine for. Antibiotics are useless against viruses, and the virus has a high rate of mutation. So basically, when a person has AIDS, they have a very low white blood cell count. And as a result, they're going to have a very hard time fighting off other opportunistic infections caused by viruses. So for example, something as simple as influenza could evolve into something more serious like pneumonia. So how can HIV spread be prevented or reduced? Well, there's the use of barrier methods of contraception, so for example condoms and diaphragms, limiting the number of sexual partners or being faithful to a single partner, regular HIV blood screening, education on safe sex for the young and the underprivileged, the use of antiretroviral therapies, so for example use of the medication AZT to minimize symptoms and spread. There's also specific medication therapy that's used for pregnant women to limit the spread to their babies. There's also reducing stigma and discrimination against HIV positive people so that they are more likely to get tested and they'll know, well, what's the next steps, at least in order to prevent further infection and further spread of the disease. Factors that affect regional distribution of AIDS include, well, 1. Culture. Some cultures discourage use of condoms, some encourage multiple partners, and some cultures have a high stigma against HIV, and this would lead to HIV patients being unwilling to admit their HIV status or get tested, with the risk of, not getting a job or being discriminated against by their peers. There's a long incubation period for HIV, so since HIV may not be detected by blood tests until 3 months into incubation, an HIV positive person may not know that they have HIV yet and can unknowingly spread it during that time. Ease of travel. So whenever there's a large number of tourists, especially those partaking in sex tourism with locals, the virus can quickly spread to local populations. Then there's poverty and lack of education. This encourages sex work, which would facilitate spread if done irresponsibly. There's a lack of antiretroviral health care in some countries and a lack of educational programs that would inform about HIV transmission and prevention. Obesity is defined as having a BMI of over 30. BMI stands for body mass index, and it can be calculated by taking one's mass in kilograms and dividing it by their height in meters and squaring that value. Now, BMI is not the best indicator of health because according to this index here, a bodybuilder might be classed as obese because they would have a high muscle mass compared to their height. So obesity typically occurs due to the overconsumption of foods rich in carbohydrates, refined sugars, and energy-dense lipids, fats and oils. So when consumed in excess, the molecules are converted for storage and they become deposited in fatty tissues beneath the skin. And these can be deposited below the dermis, as I just said, or around organs. When it's below the dermis, it is called subcutaneous fat, and around organs, it is called visceral fat, which is very, very dangerous. And this could increase the chances of developing non-communicable diseases such as type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular diseases such as coronary heart disease, kidney failure, and fatty liver disease. So let's take a look at diabetes type 1 and type 2. Now typically what would happen is that you would eat your sugary foods or your sugary meals, your pancreas would secrete insulin, and that insulin is going to bind to the cells and allow the glucose from the bloodstream to enter the cells. And thus your blood glucose level is going to drop. So a person who has type 1 diabetes, they are going to produce little to no insulin. So as a result now, the glucose cannot enter the cells. This is because insulin is like a key that would open a door. The door being the cell membrane of the cell. So if there's no key, the door cannot open. So this form of diabetes is genetic and is usually diagnosed in childhood. Patients with this type of diabetes have to take insulin injections for all of their life. Type 2 diabetes occurs when the patients produce insulin, but the insulin receptors on the cells do not respond to that insulin. So they say that they have insulin resistance. So in this case here, is like the key is still there, but the key is not working properly. So in this case here, this is due to accumulation of fat around the pancreas or sedentary lifestyle. So if the patient exercises frequently, the insulin could then bind properly to the cell membrane and you would have less insulin resistance. Or they could take oral medications such as metformin, or they can simply reduce their carbohydrate intake. So here we could see a graph showing blood glucose concentration versus time. So let's say that the person here eats a meal at 0 hours, right at the beginning of the graph. And let's look at the person who's normal. We could see that their blood glucose level is going to go up because they are going to absorb that glucose into their bloodstream from the intestines. And then there's going to be assimilation of that glucose into the cells. This is when the glucose would exit the bloodstream and go into the body cells. This is going to cause the blood glucose level to drop and then return to normal. Now, for a person with diabetes, whether it be diabetes type 1 or type 2, the blood glucose level is going to be naturally higher. And this is because there's going to be delayed assimilation. When that person eats a sugary meal, their blood glucose level is going to go up like this, especially if they are eating very large meals. Blood glucose level is going to rise as that gets absorbed into the bloodstream. Now, it's going to take much longer for the glucose to enter the cells because of insulin resistance or because of lack of insulin. So diabetes, whether type 1 or 2, restricts the movement of glucose from the blood capillaries into the cell cytoplasm through the cell membranes. This is going to result in fatigue and dehydration, and in the worst cases, tissue necrosis. That's the death of tissues, and amputation and infection. So in diabetes, the assimilation or the uptake by the cells of glucose is delayed. So that glucose in the bloodstream will not be taken up by the cells, especially when you have a very large meal of carbohydrates or sugars. And the blood glucose level or set point is higher for diabetics, which is more than 130 milligrams per deciliter. But to put this in a nutshell here, if you are diabetic, either you're not going to produce insulin, which is like the key to open the cell for the glucose to enter, or the key is not going to work properly. So you're going to have insulin resistance, the key is not going to work, and the glucose just remains in the bloodstream. This could be very dangerous to the tissues or cells around those capillaries. So factors that affect the regional distribution of diabetes would include, diet and obesity, due to the prevalence of fast food being the convenient option, or the prioritization of foods high in lipids and refined carbs. Examples would be like doubles in Trinidad. Sedentary lifestyles where you have long hours of office work and no time for outdoor recreation. Prenatal malnutrition or gestational diabetes, which means the mother could pass on the risk to the child. And they have age, ethnicity, and genetics, which the risk increases with age, and people of African and Asian descent are observed to more commonly develop type 2 diabetes. So arteriosclerosis refers to the condition where plaques form and adhere to the arterial walls, and this would reduce the lumen size, basically the passageway for the blood to flow. The plaques are made up of deposits of cholesterols and chemicals from tobacco smoke. A high pressure flow now could transform the plaque into a thrombus or blood clot. This could lead to a heart attack if this blood clot was to get lodged into a coronary artery in the heart. So as previously said, if the thrombus was to fracture and enter a coronary artery, which are those that surround the heart's muscles will not receive enough oxygenated blood, so it will not be able to beat properly. So this would eventually lead to a heart attack and potential death if it's not treated soon enough. So remember, this decrease in lumen size means that there's less area available for blood flow unless the heart applies more force. And this could lead to elevated blood pressure or hypertension, basically if you're above 140 or 90 millimeters mercury of pressure. Lastly, a stroke could happen similar to with the heart, but if the carotid arteries that carry blood to the brain are blocked. Okay, so just to give a basic definition here, a pathogen is a disease-causing microorganism. As I said before, this could be a bacteria, a virus, a protozoan, or fungus. A vector is an organism that can transport a pathogen from one organism to another. So this could be flies, it could be rats, or it could be mosquitoes. So dengue fever is caused by a viral pathogen, but the vector for it is the female adult Aedes aegypti mosquito. These don't actually suffer from dengue, but they can transport that virus from one person to another. So how this happens is that the mosquito would inject its mouth parts or its proboscis into the skin of an infected person, and they would draw the infected blood from a vessel that would contain the dengue virus. The mosquito would secrete saliva that would enable this to happen without clotting. So if the bitten person has the dengue virus, the mosquito is going to draw it in and become a vector. So if the mosquito then bites an uninfected person, it's going to secrete the saliva, and that saliva is going to have the dengue virus in it, and it's going to inject the mouth parts, and the virus is going to enter the person's capillaries as a result. So the mosquito has transmitted the virus from one person to another person. Alright, so here we have the mosquito and the housefly life cycle. Let's start with the mosquito. So we have the adult mosquito, which is the active form, is a flying terrestrial insect. And these lay eggs in stagnant water sources, not flowing water like rivers, but it would be like ponds or wherever you have garbage that collects water, let's say in tins and containers and tires. So the egg is a dormant stage, and this typically lasts about 1 week. And after 1 week, they would hatch and become larvae. So these larvae now last about 2 weeks before they become a pupa. So the larvae is also an active stage, which means that they move around. But they can be eaten by anything in the water sources if there's anything like fish, for example. The pupa is a dormant stage, which means it doesn't really move around. After a few days, maybe 2 days, it hatches and metamorphosis is complete, and the baby mosquito from the eggs would become an adult mosquito, which can then go on to lay more eggs. And the mosquito has a lifespan of about 3 to 4 weeks. The housefly, on the other hand, you see is very similar. It's just that the diagrams look a little different. The adult lays eggs. But in the case here, it's not in stagnant water sources. It might be close to a food source, basically like around, in garbage. And these hatch to become larvae, or as we call them, maggots. These would then develop into pupa and then into adult. So other vector-borne diseases would include malaria, which is caused by a protozoan called Plasmodium falciparum, and it is transmitted by Anopheles mosquitoes. So the protozoans, when they enter the bloodstream, they would live in the red blood cells, and they would mainly cause inflammation in the liver and the brain. Chikungunya and Zika are two other mosquito-borne diseases, which are carried by the Aedes aegypti as the vector, and they mainly result in high fevers and tissue damage to fetuses in pregnant women. Leptospirosis bacteria is transmitted via rat urine, and houseflies transmit bacterial pathogens for cholera when they land on food and they could deposit fecal particles onto that food. So how do diseases impact society? Well, first we have the economy. Leads to strain on state-funded medical care, money for awareness campaigns and medical PPE, that's personal protective equipment. There's a reduced labor force as a result, and there's an overall drop in productivity. Businesses can be affected by lockdowns if the disease is widespread and is communicable. Trade relations are affected because there's reduced income from exports due to drop in productivity. And there's tourism, but it's affected by the stigma of the disease. Basically, nobody wants to go somewhere where they could get a disease. Food availability is affected because food shortages could occur if the agricultural sector is impacted. Household income due to privatized healthcare and medical bills, unemployment, especially if the breadwinner of the family gets sick. The quality of life decreases due to emotional and psychological tolls of illness and quarantines. We all know how it was during the lockdowns. On the other hand, though, you can have positive awareness of the disease. If it is widespread enough, it may influence those without the disease to make lifestyle changes and take extra precautions, such as washing hands more often, perhaps to exercise more often. So prevention and control of viral infections. We have 3 factors we're going to look at: social factors, biological factors, and economic factors. So the social factors would be, quarantine. Quarantine is basically you get sick, you stay home, and this limits the spread of viral infection and may have a severe effect on businesses and household earnings as a result. Safe sex, which ensures the use of condoms and limiting partners, of course prevents STI spread. Biological factors, the use of PPE, so surgical masks to prevent droplet spread, and sterilization of equipment. Vaccination reduces the incidence and the spread of infection. Good hygiene, such as regular hand washing, disinfectants, and antibacterial soaps, help to prevent or limit communicable disease spread. Regular blood screening can limit the spread of pathogens such as HIV, and antiviral drugs and monoclonal antibodies can be used to treat some viral infections. Monoclonal antibodies has been used to treat COVID-19, for example. So economic factors would include pest control, and this would be, for example, removing stagnant water sources and keeping refuse from piling up. Would also reduce the chance of vector breeding. This is called sanitary control. Insecticide spraying programs or chemical control, introducing fish to ponds, or biological controls can eradicate mosquito larvae and eggs. mosquito nets and coils or act as mechanical controls. There's awareness campaigns, money has to go into doing this, education about limiting spread and infection, and there's the cost of preventative medication. So for example, surgical masks, PPE, private doctor visits, blood screening, mammograms, biopsies for detecting cancer, even vaccines cost money to import them. Here we have some methods of preventing pathogen growth. We've spoken about most of these already, so feel free to pause the video and just read the functions. Let's look at the types of immunity. So immune responses happen due to the exposure of foreign substances or antigens that are attached to pathogens. So think of antigens, as I said, as the body's burglar alarms. Once these enter your body, it's going to stimulate an immune response. So immunity occurs due to the production of antibodies from lymphocytes. That's a type of white blood cell. So immunity can be passive or active. So passive means if antibodies are introduced from an external source. So for example, from breast milk, or if you inject an antibody serum into the body. Active immunity, on the other hand, is if the body is allowed to produce its own antibodies and memory cells as a response to the infection, such as a multi-dose vaccine, or if you just get naturally infected. That's called natural immunity. Alright, so let's break down the 4 types of immunity. So the first type here is naturally acquired active, and this occurs when there's an immune response to pathogen exposure. So this is just you walking around outside and you was to get the flu from somebody. It is highly unlikely that you would get that same strain of flu the next time. This is because your body has developed antibodies. Your lymphocytes have developed antibodies and memory cells that are gonna remember that disease, so it is unlikely that you'll get affected by it twice. A good example of this would be chickenpox. You develop a natural acquired active immunity against it. It's unlikely that you're gonna get it a second time. Natural passive immunity occurs due to a transfer of antibodies that occurs from mother to offspring, whether it's fetus or baby. So this could be either through the breast milk or through the mother's placenta. Artificially acquired active immunity is long-term immunization obtained mainly through a vaccine. So it's due to intentional exposure to the antigens. Remember, a vaccine, now you introduce a weakened version of the pathogen into the bloodstream. Your body responds to it, produces antibodies, produces memory cells, so you're unlikely to encounter it or be affected by it a second time. Artificial passive immunity is a short-term immunization obtained from the injection of antibodies into the bloodstream, such as in a serum. This is used in a treatment and there are no memory cells that are developed. I'll give you an example. Let's say that you was to get COVID-19 and you didn't get a vaccine. Well, of course, the vaccine now would be useless because you already have the disease. The vaccine is a preventative measure. So what can you do? Well, there's something called monoclonal antibodies, which is a serum that can be injected into the bloodstream that can potentially fight off the virus. But this is short term because this is not actually teaching your body how to fight the disease. It's just bringing in reserve soldiers to fight off an enemy. So let's take a closer look at vaccines here. So vaccines provide artificially acquired active immunity. They stimulate the production of antibodies due to the intentional introduction of an antigen into the bloodstream. So they are usually multi-dose because they produce multiple immune responses, and they are used for communicable diseases such as measles, HPV, and rubella. So vaccines have numerous modes of action. So this could include live attenuated vaccines, and these contain a weakened form of the pathogen. Inactivated vaccines contain pathogens that cannot reproduce. Subunit vaccines contain only a detectable component or protein of a pathogen, just a small part of it that your body can detect. And mRNA vaccines, for example, Pfizer vaccines, what they do is that they contain instructions so that your body can build that part of the virus within you. I know that sounds a little dangerous, but basically it's only synthesizing a small part of the virus so that your body will know what it looks like. So what are some advantages and disadvantages of using vaccines? So first of all, vaccines are often successful at stimulating antibodies and memory cell production. So it often reduces the severity of the infection. So even if you do get infected, you would fight it off fast enough that you don't get the full blow of signs and symptoms. It also reduces incidence rate, so less people will get potentially infected and spread the pathogen to the uninfected or vulnerable. This is called herd immunity. Disadvantages: well, viruses mutate often and produce variants. We know that with Delta and Omicron, for example, with COVID. And these are different from the versions that are found in vaccines. In this case here, the vaccine might be useless or might not be as effective. So vaccines may also cause severe allergic reactions. This is called anaphylaxis. This is rare, however. Lastly, the immunocompromised, which would be the sick and the elderly, and very small babies may be at risk of getting ill with the vaccine. Drug abuse. Well, a drug is an externally administered substance that alters the body's physiology. They can be prescribed, such as painkillers, sedatives for sleep, and medical marijuana. But drug abuse occurs when the use of the drug leads to physiological or psychological harm to the user, their family, or society at large. It leads to drug dependency, withdrawal symptoms when the drug is not used, or possibly overdose. The progressive decrease in response to a drug is called tolerance. So basically, the first time that you used to take a drug, it will be highly effective. If you take it 10 more times, it's going to get less and less and less effective. You see that you build up tolerance to the drugs. So there are four main classifications of drugs. There are stimulus, which there are four main classifications of drugs. There are stimulants, which increase nervous transmission. Examples of this would be cocaine and methamphetamine or crystal meth. Depressants, which decrease nervous transmission, they slow you down basically. Examples of this would be alcohol and codeine. Hallucinogens, which cause hallucinations. Examples would be marijuana, ecstasy, LSD, and PCP. And we have narcotics, which are used to treat pain. Examples would be heroin and morphine and fentanyl. So even if you have prescribed medication like antibiotics, these can be abused or misused. So patients who do not complete the full course of an antibiotic prescription will run the risk of having antibiotic-resistant bacteria develop in their bodies. I'll give you an example. Let's say that your doctor prescribes a 2-week course of antibiotics. You only take it for 1 week and you feel like you're feeling better, so you stop taking it. If you only take it for 1 week, the weakest bacteria is going to die, but the strongest ones are still going to be there. So most of the normal bacteria are going to die. But the resistant bacteria, these are the lighter colored ones in this diagram, these are going to start multiplying because they're not taking the antibiotic anymore. And these antibiotic resistant pathogens are going to keep multiplying. And as a result, now the disease is going to come back worse than before. The same antibiotic is not going to be as effective. And remember, some antibiotics have addictive properties, which can make the user experience withdrawal when the course of treatment ends. So what is the difference between psychological and physiological drug dependency? Well, let's look at 2 case studies here. Wayne is 16 years old and smokes cannabis with his friends. He often goes without cannabis for days at a time with no ill effects. However, after a week has passed, he feels a strong urge to smoke, especially when he feels depressed or bored. So Wayne is showing psychological dependency, and this is usually characterized by lack of strong withdrawal symptoms, so he doesn't actually get any sickness when he stops. The ability to go prolonged periods without the drug, in this case he can go after like a whole week. And his drug abuse is usually influenced by social factors or by boredom. Physical or physiological drug dependency, however. Let's look at Sandra. So she's 40 years old and uses heroin in 2 to 4 injections, 4 to 12 hours apart. When she goes for longer than 12 hours without heroin, she feels sick and becomes anxious. So Sandra is showing physical or physiological dependence because she has strong cravings, she has withdrawal symptoms if the drug is abruptly stopped for short periods, and her symptoms worsen as the frequency of the drug abuse increases. In terms of alcohol or the scientific name ethanol is a depressant. So when consumed in excess, it can heavily impair nervous transmission and can lead to dehydration of tissues. There are many social consequences of alcohol abuse. So one is car accidents due to the decreased reaction time, impaired motor skills and judgment. You won't be able to react on time. Violence and fighting due to the loss of inhibition, altercations may escalate. Family breakdown due to aggressive behavior, domestic violence, child neglect. If the breadwinner is an alcoholic and becomes unemployed, it could lead the family into financial turmoil. Academic neglect for younger people and students. There's the inability to concentrate, they could neglect their grades, there's absenteeism from school, and there's poor sexual intercourse decisions. There's reduced inhibition. You might have sex with somebody that you really don't want to have sex with. The risk of STIs and undesirable pregnancies. There are many health consequences of alcohol abuse as well. So first is, of course, impaired nervous transmission. So since neurotransmitter activity will slow down, reaction time is going to decrease and perception becomes distorted. For example, you're going to have reduced motor skills and blurry vision. The cerebrum and the cerebellum in the brain are going to get affected. Dehydration is going to occur because ADH, which is usually released by the pituitary gland in the brain, is going to get suppressed. ADH allows water to get reabsorbed from the kidneys back into the bloodstream. So less water is going to get reabsorbed into the blood. This is going to lead to dehydration, frequent urination, and hangovers. There's an increased risk of cardiovascular diseases because blood vessels are actually constricted by alcohol. And this could increase the chances of a blood clot rupture and an ensuing heart attack or stroke. In terms of cigarettes, cigarettes contain tar and particulates, carbon monoxide, and nicotine. So tar and particulates lead to irritation in the airways and the breakdown of elastin in the lungs. This would create very large air spaces in the alveoli, and this reduces surface area for gaseous exchange and leads also to a buildup of fluid. This is called emphysema. It also leads to excess mucus production in the lungs, which is a breeding ground for bacteria. Ciliated cells are destroyed, that's basically cells with tiny hairs on them, and this would increase the risk of bronchitis because those tiny hairs actually trap dust and bacteria. So bacteria would now enter the airways and the bloodstream, which could lead to other infections as well. Carbon monoxide is a colorless, odorless gas that is in cigarette smoke, and this could bind very quickly to red blood cells, and it will basically occupy the space instead of oxygen. This could lead to potential suffocation or asphyxiation. Of course, in the case of cigarettes, you wouldn't die from carbon monoxide, but it would reduce the amount of oxygen being carried to the cells. So even being in an environment of smokers and inhaling the components poses a threat. So this is called secondhand smoke or passive smoking. Now remember, cigarette smoke also contains the addictive component nicotine, which is a stimulant, and this increases heart rate and blood pressure. Pollution is defined as the contamination of the environment due to the harmful disposal of waste. A pollutant is a contaminant disposed into the environment causing harm to it. So we're going to look at different categories of pollution. Of course, pollution involves land pollution, air pollution, water pollution, and noise pollution. But we're going to look at it as domestic pollution, industrial pollution, and agricultural pollution. Domestic pollution comes from households, and this will include detergents, litter or refuse, or exhaust from cars. Industrial pollution involves heavy metal, oil being dumped into water, or thermal pollution. Thermal pollution could basically occur due to gases, very hot gases going into the atmosphere, or very hot chemicals being dumped into water. This, of course, could affect any life living there. Agricultural pollutions occur when fertilizers and pesticides run off into water sources. So sewage runoff to water supplies can lead to cholera and typhoid because they may contain fecal particles and bacteria. Combustion of refuse can lead to respiratory diseases like bronchitis. This is basically when you burn rubbish. Excess carbon in the atmosphere, because when this burns it releases carbon dioxide, also leads to climate change, rises in temperature and sea level. The accumulation of waste on land can provide breeding grounds for flies and rats because they could live there, they could feed on any trash here, and they could breed here, and this could contribute to higher incidences of cholera and leptospirosis. Runoff of any sewage or fertilizer into water sources can lead to eutrophication or algal blooms. Basically, this is the overgrowth of algae. So fertilizers contain nitrates and phosphates, and these facilitate algal growths. Now, due to this algal growth here, this is going to use up a lot of oxygen in the water. So the oxygen is going to get rapidly depleted. So aquatic life is going to suffocate as a result. So even though they're living underwater, they still need oxygen. And they could also block sunlight from coming into contact with other plants. It prevents other plants from photosynthesizing. We have two types of products here, biodegradable products and non-biodegradable products. Biodegradable products are able to be decomposed by microorganisms in a relatively short period of time. Examples would be paper, wood, food, and cloth. Non-biodegradable products cannot be decomposed by microorganisms, or they take a very long time to do so. Examples would be glass, plastic, metal, and nylon. So how do we control pollution? Well, first there are laws. Laws that prevent the dumping of oils and agricultural chemicals into water, and laws that limit carbon emissions from factories. So there are also laws that prevent large gatherings in nature areas. This helps to reduce noise pollution, but also land pollution, because wherever there's large areas, there's going to be a lot of littering and garbage. And this is going to disrupt animal behavior. You could have cleanup crews for beaches and rivers. There's also just basic social responsibility for using litter cans, or if you go into the beach, take a garbage bag with you so you could take your trash home. There's also the use of renewable resources such as wind turbines, solar panels, hydroelectric dams, and there's also the use of hybrid vehicles and fluorescent lights. These either prevent or mitigate or reduce carbon emissions into the atmosphere. So let's look at the water cycle, and let's start with water in the ocean. So first, this water is going to evaporate, and evaporation is the conversion of water to water vapor. Transpiration is when water evaporates from the leaves of plants. This water vapor now is going to condense, undergo condensation, where that water vapor is going to cool to form clouds. Now remember, respiration also occurs, and water vapor is released when we breathe out. So when we exhale, we also release water vapor into the atmosphere. So after this water vapor condenses and forms clouds, we're going to have precipitation, and this is the conversion of the water vapor to water as rain or snow. So when rain falls, for example, water is going to run off back into streams and rivers and back into oceans. This is just called runoff. And lastly, we have filtration, which is the collection of precipitate or water that is stored in layers of rock and limestone. So when the water goes through the soil, that is called leaching. How do we test water for bacteria? Well, first we have a sterilized cotton swab, and this will be dipped in the water sample or whatever sample that you're testing for. The swab is then rubbed against some agar gel, and it typically is rubbed like side to side or is rubbed in just small little deposits. This agar gel contains nutrients, so like glucose and proteins that allow growth of the bacteria. You seal the petri dish, so it's securely closed, and after a few weeks, bacterial colonies like little spots are going to appear, and then you could observe these under a microscope to see exactly what is what. How is large-scale water purification done? Well, one, the water is collected from the households, this is just called collection, and then it's passed through a screen. So screening removes large waste particles and sediment. The water then flows into a settlement tank, and the denser waste is going to sink to the bottom. The dry sludge is going to be transported to landfills. Then it's going to flow into an aeration tank which contains aerobic bacteria. These bacteria respire, and they're going to digest the smaller sewage particles as oxygen is pumped into the tank. After the aeration tank, the water is going to be pumped into a chlorination tank, where chlorine or purification tablets are added to kill any remaining bacteria. At this point here, now the water is drinkable or potable. So distribution is going to occur of this potable water to be pumped back into households. So to take a closer look at biological filters, which is part of the large-scale water purification system, biological filters are pumped with aerobic bacteria and oxygen. As said before, the bacteria decompose and digest the organic matter in the sewage over time. They basically use it as food, and the very small particles are going to float to the top, as you see in here, and this is going to get released as effluent, while larger particles settle at the base. So these larger particles, that sink to the base here, these are going to get returned as activated sludge to the biological filter, where the whole process is going to start over again until we get less and less and less sewage in the system. Sewage disposal practices. We have improper practices and proper practices. Let's look at the improper ones first. Improper would be just if you take the sewage and you use to dump it into a water source like a river or pond, for example. Well, this could lead to eutrophication, which is the buildup of algae, as previously said. And also, if you was to take the sewage and you was to bury it, or if you was to bury it close to water sources such as wells, or you was to bury it close to the water table, the bacteria from that sewage could leach into the soil and could possibly pollute the soil and could deter growth of plants there, and also could affect any animals or underground life. Also, if there's people drinking from the well where the sewage is buried, this could lead to cholera and dysentery and typhoid. So the proper practices would be to use septic tanks, which would collect the sewage and wastewater into large underground tanks, which are pumped and disposed of on a regular basis. There's also biological filters, which is involved in large-scale water purifications. These are tanks that contain aerobic bacteria to digest sewage. We just went into that. Domestic refuse disposal. So individuals can dispose of organic matter in compost boxes. These contain bacteria, earthworms, small insects that will digest this organic matter. This is just if you're getting rid of garbage within, in your home. Now also the refuse from harvest, for example from corn, can be used as a biodiesel or biofuels. Now households can work to separate non-biodegradables, for example plastics and glass, from their biodegradables so that they can be placed in recycling bins. Now, of course, combustion or burning is a quick method of eradicating waste, but this results in air pollution, carbon emissions, and respiratory issues. Landfills generally involve the burial of waste materials. So you have a large piece of land is excavated and the waste is buried there. This would prevent accumulation of solid waste and breeding grounds for vectors because they're underground, they're not exposed. So what happens here is that decomposer bacteria, they're gonna break down the material, but they're gonna produce a significant amount of methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas. But typically landfills have a catchment system or recovery system that could be installed to prevent the gases from actually seeping into the atmosphere. That's what you're seeing in the middle here. So these landfills would also contain impermeable liners to catch harmful liquids from leaching into the soil. This could be like battery fluid, for example. So what is the difference between a dump and a landfill? Well, dumps are typically smaller than landfills. Landfills are pretty large. Dumps are usually open and they're not covered with soil on a daily basis, so they typically produce a lot of bad odors or bad smells, and they do not deter pests. So these could be used as breeding grounds sometimes for rats and flies. Dumps do not have a liner to catch any liquid leachate. For example, battery acid, as I mentioned before, produced by solid waste. So a lot of this is going to enter the soils, and if the dump is close to a water source, it's going to enter the water table. Dumps do not have a treatment system or methane collection, so all those greenhouse gases are going into the atmosphere. Alright, so let's look at controlling solid waste volumes. So Earth has a growing population, and a growing population means that there's greater amounts of waste being produced and less space to store that waste. So we need to be able to control how much waste we actually produce. We need to reduce the amount of solid waste that we have. So how can we do that? Well, we work with the 3 R's: reuse, reduce, and recycle. So reusing means to repurpose waste materials, so finding other roles for them. Examples would be refilling water bottles, using old materials as plant pots. Reducing means simply consciously choosing biodegradable materials over non-biodegradable. So choosing paper, for example, versus choosing plastic. There's less and less buildup of waste over time. So recycling materials means that you break their structure down and transform them into new materials. So for example, with glass, that glass would be crushed or melted and then reformed or remolded into new glass products. So the materials are crushed and then sorted by size and type. Magnets are going to separate any metals from non-metals. So plastics and glass, as I said, may be remolded to manufacture new products, and some paper may be pulped and repulped and may be reused as well. So what are some impacts on environmental issues on humans? Well, let's start with flooding. So flooding can occur due to the rise in sea levels due to climate change, which we know is as a result of a lot of carbon emissions and pollution. So if there's a lot of solid waste accumulating by waterways as well, they could block the waterways and lead to rivers and sewage systems overflowing. This now could lead to disease, because if there's a lot of sewage systems overflowing and a lot of floods and a lot of garbage being piled up, a lot of litter piles. This may attract flies and rats, which we know are vectors for cholera and leptospirosis. If we have a lot of discarded tires and cans and tins, these may collect water and may act as mosquito breeding grounds. Food security is also going to be affected because if you have polluted soil and waterways, this could lead to high toxicity in plant and animal food sources. So for example, when mercury is being dumped into oceans and fish was to absorb that mercury into their cells, and then people eat that fish, they get mercury poisoning as a result. Lastly, now we have the economic impact of these issues. Flood damage and diseases result in high infrastructure and health costs for families and countries. Also, highly polluted areas and countries are going to draw in less tourists as a result. So we have a reduced revenue for that country. So that's HSB. Good luck. Take care.